Hi guys, this is John Edward Willie, and that is the moon above me. It must be a sign. I made a video before about keeping a life notebook, that is, keeping a sort of journal that allows you to maximize your control over your life, a sort of journal that's focused on what philosophers call instrumental thinking, which means a thinking that allows you to exercise your ability to make your life better and to improve things all around, to think clearly. There's a certain level of self-examination that goes on in keeping a diary. And that has everything to do with what I call corporealism, or a philosophy that begins with life. It begins with the body. It begins with the earth. It begins with what I call pre-philosophical assumptions. In other words, the corporeal is a set of not even beliefs, but almost attitudes or dispositions that have to do with beginning with, as I say, an affirmation of life and dealing with life and recognizing that there's a certain sense in which life is difficult precisely because it's difficult. And, that's sort of a follow through on the underlying discovery that death is, as they say, the easy way, that death takes care of itself. And so there's a sense in which life's difficulty is not only where it's at, but it's also a great source of pleasure and richness. And that's what the life notebook is all about. But this notebook that I'm talking about here is a different kind of notebook, because what I'm talking about is a notebook where you're practicing self-education, where you're sort of practicing the habit of paying attention and thinking through what it is that you observe. Because the life notebook is not what, as they sometimes call, the commonplace book to be, or a notebook where you're keeping track of things that you discover, like bits of information and observations and things that it's like a book that allows you to contain, almost in a messy, disordered kind of way, the kind of things that you encounter. And so what I'm imagining here isn't even like the notebook that I keep, but I'm sort of imagining the ideal notebook, even on this beautiful night that almost seems contrary to what I'm describing. I think that the notebook that I think of is a brain. It's ultimately a brain in the sense that it's sort of a container for receiving everything that I take in. And so a part of the practice of keeping this notebook is recording the more fascinating, more interesting things that I discover. And that includes lectures that I listen to, or books that I read, or conversations that I have, or it could be simple drawing itself. It could be writing about sensory activity, like sort of describing in a linguistic way what one is smelling and sensing and hearing, and sort of attuning oneself to the immediacy of your world. Because the thing that's simple but complex about keeping a notebook of the kind I'm describing is that one thinks that it's easy to pay attention. One thinks that it's easy to learn. But as soon as you start activating your education with this notebook, you discover, for instance, that if you try to draw something, that it's actually really hard to simply look at reality. Or if you're simply trying to transcribe the thoughts that you've heard, it's actually quite difficult. So there's a sort of underlying process that goes on in the act of keeping this notebook. But what I have in mind is sort of, to me, exhilaratingly different. You know, I have a different kind of a spin on it because I'm very much inspired by the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, which I discovered when I was about 16 years old, and they're sort of fundamental in my own development. And the thing about Leonardo's notebooks is that they're non-systematic, so they're open-ended, they're messy, without an ordering principle, except that there in fact are many underlying principles that I picked up on, and they're part of my own notebooks. And those principles include a desire to experiment and to test what it is that you take in. So there's a sense in which curiosity in a notebook isn't merely like this free-falling kind of curiosity that's whimsical, because what we mean is a curiosity where you have a thirst to test out the ideas that you've heard. And what does it mean to test out your ideas? It means to question. It means to actively question what it is that you absorb, because a commonplace book is like a place where one can record information. And I think one thing to add on real quick that I want to talk about more later is that it's an objective notebook. So you're not thinking subjectively about yourself like a diary or a travel log or anything like that. You're trying to think in a way where you value the world outside of yourself, and you're holding on to the knowledge that I believe comes through practicing attention, practicing observation. So I spent most of my adult life pursuing the classical education of reading books and asking really deep questions and pursuing really big ideas. And what can't be neglected, however, is the fact that on a certain level, like commonsensically, the really smart people are the ones that are just really paying attention, like in many different ways, but ways that are sort of like obvious. And so there's a certain level in which you're wanting to begin with that kind of intuition and sort of see the notebook that I'm imagining is an ideal notebook as being something that could be like an externalized brain. That's why that's the first sort of image that I'm using. And I think that in doing that, you're allowing yourself to see that the education that you're seeking, because this, to me, this has always been an externalization of my self-education, the way that I've self-educated myself. And I was inspired by Leonardo's notebooks. And the other thing I wanted to say that I was inspired by are the essays of Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, because he reflects human consciousness in a way that I think is sort of admirable in regards to his willingness to tell the truth about who, in many ways, we are when we're paying attention, when we're actively seeing who we are. And so there's a sense in which this self-examination that's fundamental to philosophy is something that is missing in philosophy, because self-examination itself has to be an active thing. I mean, in other words, you have to have a pen or pencil in hand, and on a certain level, simply drawing or observing or attuning yourself to the world around you is something that amplifies this underlying ability to call out bullshit in philosophy. You know, bullshit in philosophy emerges because people are so easily confused when they're not really even beginning in the right place. They're not even like beginning with the belief that their own bodies and brains and senses and intuition is something to be trusted, that it's something to be started with. In other words, your experience matters, and your experience is where you test philosophy. That's what I think of the notebook as being. So it's simultaneously like an open-ended mind mapping, drawing, like a lot of doodling, a lot of like to-do lists, a lot of like random projects that are imagined but never pursued. You know, I'm less visually oriented than Leonardo. I'm more like Montaigne in the sense that I write essays, and that in many ways is what I am. But the blank notebook is a wonderful way to allow yourself to think in visual ways that ultimately augment and really help the critical thinking that's involved in thinking about writing essays or poems. Because there's a certain level at which when you're thinking visually and you're using what they call mind maps, where you're loosening up and using images and lines and connections in order to think visually about your ideas. That's something that has been instrumental to me in making me the kind of thinking person that I am, because I tend to highly value what's called the synoptic, which is the relationship between ideas. It's a way of thinking about things in terms of their underlying relations. And that in itself is precisely what the notebook can allow for. It can allow for you to do things that typing, for instance, doesn't really allow. Typing doesn't really allow you to practice what could be called, I hate to say it, but a nonlinear, orthogonal sort of approach that allows you to, as I say, think indirectly by connecting dots, connecting thoughts that otherwise wouldn't be thought. And so I should have prefaced this whole thing by saying that I'm not showing like my notebook. I'm not doing what I've seen 50 YouTubers doing, which is to have this like artificial presentation of this notebook that seems really clinical, you know. Mine is nothing like that. You know, mine is truly a mess, because mine is a reflection of an order that begins to make sense to me over time. And it's a way for me as a compulsive lecture listener. You know, I'm constantly like listening to either music or lectures about virtually everything. And so this book allows me to keep track of all the things that I'm taking in. And every morning I like to read. And so there's a sense in which I have a methodology behind the way that I study, but so much else would be lost if I wasn't putting it in a centralized place. Like I'm reading this biography of Emily Dickinson by Richard Sewell, and it's magnificent and huge. And the only way that I can make my way through it is with a pencil and a ruler, and by keeping track by rewriting the passages that I most love. It's almost like in rewriting things, you understand them better because it forces you sort of to slow down in ways that you might not slow down. So I think that slowing down too, especially regardless of how we want to see ourselves, like that slowing down act that the notebook, like keeping a pen, forces, is ultra beneficial, because it really like forces you to do what technology can't do, which is to pay attention by slowing down and not thinking constantly in a way where something always means something else. You know, you could say that the very issues in our brain that really keep us stuck has to do with the fact that we are very rarely living in a state that's anything like how our ancestors have lived. Not that I believe in like a division between the natural and the synthetic, or that we should go back or go forward. I don't believe in any of that. But there's certainly something to be said for our precarious situation where we're so bombarded with information, and there's an industry dedicated to winning over our attention, that, you know, the notebook itself is almost like a militant reaction to that industry. It's almost like the fight for your own autonomy begins with a commonplace notebook, except that, as I suggest, I don't mean the kind that other people are keeping. What I mean to keep is a place where my curiosity is given form. Curiosity is like the underlying fuel in self-education. And curiosity comes from a deep desire to understand, to know the truth. It comes from a desire to see the truth in its multitude of forms, to see that it has to do with beauty as much as it does to do with truth in language. And so there's a certain sense in which even aesthetic beauty, absorbing that, is a part of the self-educative process that I've been on. And I've been suggesting a few points regarding the possibilities of what a notebook can mean. And I've suggested that it's sort of like an external brain, in the way that books are like externalized human knowledge. But the notebook, ideally, is actually a working brain that we are making. So it's sort of like an animation of the self-education process. And it also means that we can consider the notebook as a thing that is enabling self-examination, meaning that by writing what you think or see or hear or learn, you're seeing what you're absorbing, and by seeing, you're mirroring in many ways what it is that you're learning. And that act of mirroring is that act of self-awareness that occurs in the act. It occurs indirectly as an act of recording, because even these recordings that I do are a sort of notebook, given that the benefit I get doesn't have to do anything with YouTube subscribers or money or anything, because the very benefit comes with being self-aware enough about what I'm putting out to learn from myself and sort of get better with each video. And so that's what I mean by the mirror as being the second metaphor in like what a notebook could ideally be. And as I mentioned, I imagine a notebook as being a combination of notes, like prose, but also mind maps and drawings. And I see attention, the practice of attention, as being fundamental to education in the same way that the great books tradition is. So it's like 17, 18 minutes into this video before I even know what I'm thinking or what I'm trying to say. And so I'm laying out various metaphors regarding my variations on this theme of a commonplace book, of a notebook. And so we discover that self-examination is something that you see in art when painters are doing self-portraits. Why do we think that that's not the same kind of self-examination as what Plato and other philosophers have been advocating? Are we not visual beings? Is there not something to be seen and celebrated about the physical? Is there something about our residual hatred for the physical world that comes to be with traditions and thought that make us look down on the physical world, that makes us not value visual information? Because to draw is to practice the most fundamental human act, which is the triangulation of actuality through the hand-eye coordination involved. And so there's a sense in which what one is doing when one keeps a notebook is to also be performing. There's a sense in which the notebook is a kind of stage. There's a sense in which it is a performance of the visual, a performance of the body. But the well-kept notebook is also a performative dimension where one can experiment with anything and get away with anything if you let go of the idea that it's going to be public or seen and see it really as a central personal thing, as a brain, as a mirror, but also as a stage where one can allow oneself to let go. You can sort of ask questions that you otherwise would not be asking. You can say things that you otherwise would not say. And you can see what it would look like to have said that aloud. And the benefits that come with that are endless. And so when I'm thinking about, keeping a notebook, I think about something that is to be used. It's something where your education is coming in and you're putting it to use, you're putting it to value. You are utilizing what you take in. And so that means returning to it by properly documenting what you record with titles, I use hashtags, or with other symbols that allow you to keep track of how you're going to extract what you're doing. Because it's not merely a cheery, fun affair. Like what we're doing in this act of keeping the notebook is also testing the ideas and things that we encounter. I like to record questions that I come up with, and I like to come up with different kinds of themes that allow me to focus on particular things for a few days or for a week. Like as simply as thinking about a color like blue for 2 or 3 days can have a particular effect when you're keeping track of your perceptions. And so there's a sense in which the notebook is a sort of laboratory where one is in many ways really testing what it is that one takes in and being in many ways brutally honest and being directly honest to oneself about what is working and what is not working. And so I think that sensory acuity, or that sensitivity to reality itself, to getting things right, that's also a strong element of a notebook. It's not a daydreaming activity, although there's certainly daydreaming infused into it. So I don't know, a lot of these thoughts are just sort of open-ended regarding sort of what it is that I've been doing with my notebook and how I think about my notebook and how I think about I could get better at sort of keeping one. And I think I'll sort of show it in the future, sort of give everyone a taste of it. But I've always assumed that it wouldn't be public, or that, it had nothing to do with other people. And I think that very personal act is pivotal, because one cannot really practice this if it's something that is presentational or something that is for others. The notebook itself is a passageway. It's sort of like a door frame, to use my next metaphor. It's a door frame insofar as you're not making it the end in itself. Like the reason why it can be messy and the reason why you can allow yourself to let go and see whatever you want to see and let your ears hear whatever they want to hear. And of course you want to organize this chaos into some kind of order. And as I mentioned, you do discover a methodology over time. But I think that this methodology is not the point in itself, nor is even the notebook. The notebook itself is a door that you're sort of opening into a world where you can better make sense of things and you can plan out your projects And what I mean by plan out your projects, for me specifically, it's my projects regarding self-education, like what I'm studying and learning, because there's always a set number of things that I'm paying attention to, and they sort of don't change because they're sort of the fundamentals of who I am. And it has to do with thinking about writing and thinking about perception and thinking about how attention is in fact a crown jewel of evolution rather than intelligence or virtue or beauty or anything like that. I think that simply being finely attuned is crucial. And I think that if I had to break all of this down into like 3 different points, because I mentioned that the notebook is like a brain and that it's a container of what we receive, and it's a way not only of containing but externalizing what we take in. So that twofold practice is like a brain, in that the brain is, when it's healthy, actively absorbing and also communicating, giving back. And so I see that analogy as fundamental to the idea that the notebook is an externalization of the brain, in the way that books are an externalization of the culture, except that the notebook allows you for a deeply autonomous, personally individual development of an externalized brain. Because why would you need other books if you could create your own book? In fact, that's how I've sort of thought about this notebook, and also the Architext, which is like this encyclopedia that I'm writing, which is in many ways my own autonomous attempt to externalize my self-education. And so the next metaphor that I'd use was the mirror, that the notebook allows for you to practice that art of self-reflection, self-examination that's so paramount in philosophy, but is neglected when we neglect the physical perceptual element. So even drawing and recording your senses and just learning how to see in a way that is direct and honest, that in itself is a continuation of self-education. Like learning how to accurately capture what it is that you're trying to record. And so that's what I think of as the mirroring element that philosophy overlooks, because philosophy overlooks the immediate, and what we should privilege, I think, is our own experience. And so the notebook allows us to focus on that experience in a way that I think opens up a self-awareness that is not merely linguistic. It has to do with the visual kind of self-awareness that I think I'll bring up later in other videos. But the notebook is also a stage where one isn't merely documenting what they learn, although one is attempting to objectively capture what they absorb in videos or from other people or from books. But you're wanting to play with it. You're wanting to use mind maps, you're wanting to experiment, you're wanting to dance around and let yourself go. And that's what it means to be a stage, because it's a place where you're sort of discovering yourself as you go. Like the notebook gives you a place to sort of discover who you are in the very act of saying it. And that's an amazing experience. Like you make these spontaneous discoveries. But I also mentioned that the brain is like a laboratory, because the brain, not the brain, but the external brain that I imagine the notebook to be, is a laboratory where you're testing these notions and you're practicing a particular kind of precise observation that is vital, that demands perhaps doing things as simple as setting forth a thesis or a hypothesis or a theme, and then observing it or paying attention, like smells. What do you smell in a day? Or you could practice philosophically imagining the things that you're reading, but in a deeper way on a daily basis, and then taking notes about it. So there's a sense in which this laboratory offers not a scientific way of thinking about the self, but more specifically, a way of asking oneself to demonstrate what one takes in. There is a pivotal sense in which if you can't really say in your own words what you think you know, do you really know it? And so the last little metaphor that I'd mentioned was the door, that more than anything, the notebook itself is not a finished product. It's not something that you're showing to your friends. It's not something that you're posting on YouTube. The notebook itself is a mezzanine to a higher level, to completing the projects, to practicing the deeper arts that are necessary, like learning how to see, and learning how to ask questions that are really good. The art of question asking is something that stream of consciousness in a journal can allow for, and it's quite marvelous, And so we discover this in the act of saying what we almost feel like we're not supposed to say. And so it allows us also to practice saying things to ourselves in a way that when you speak to others later, or if you're recording videos like I am, you find it's much easier to say it because you said it. Of course, half the time I'm just garbled up and inarticulate, but that's when I know that I need to find some kind of centering. And that's what the notebook can mean. It's sort of a centering thing that allows me to come back to myself. And so the three things that I had mentioned as being philosophically crucial are the attitude that you have in keeping a notebook, keeping this ideal journal as I imagine it. You have to begin with wonder. Aristotle had said that philosophy begins with wonder. And so I think that you have to begin with a sense of awe at life. And that could come late at night, that could come in the morning. Whatever time of day that comes for you, that's when you should start allowing yourself to articulate that, because the flat refusal to think of life as mysterious is probably what prevents the very opening of life. Meaning that if life is not mysterious or curious to you, then in many ways you're not on a path at all. Life is just happening to you. So you have to at least orient oneself in such a way that you have a desire to take in the truth, not what you think or feel, but what you see, and to pursue those questions as far as you can. The journal allows you to pursue these questions as far as you can. And when you're animated by wonder, you discover that everyday life is wondrous, and that's visually true, but it's also intellectually true, emotionally true. It's ever expanding. And that's why the journal is a doorway, is like an aperture through which you can see more clearly the life that is right in front of you, which is in fact full of fascinating problems. Like, one can use the notebook as a way of capturing all these problems, not like philosophical problems unless you have those, but just normal problems. And then you can look at them and you can work on them. It's a great habit to have. But even more than that, I think what happens is that if you're really following through, you find that these observations and these excursions and these wanderings and these pursuals invariably lead to other questions. Questions are what returns, and there's sort of like a circulation in this questioning and pursual that is integral to Circle 8, to precisely what I'm attempting to do here. And so it's sort of a call and response kind of thing that I think over time, like, and I type too. I keep a typed journal, but I also keep this sort of handwritten journal that's a little bit more old-fashioned. And what I find over time is that all of these acts that are like silly, like it seems like a waste of time, right? I've also like gone on walks every day for like 10 years now, recording myself talking. And on a certain level, it's meaningless because I haven't made anything out of it or used it for anything. But on another level, this very thing is sort of the fodder from which I am feeding, because what I have deepened is my experience of the mystery of life. And that's what I'm getting at, is the first of these three principles, is that you have to begin with the sense of mystery. And one has to think like a detective. Like one has to think not about mystical revelation, but about the oddity of people and human nature and the ways in which that might be investigated. Because you yourself are sort of like an example of human nature. And you might think that you know yourself, but in observing yourself, you become more mysterious. And that's what enchants the person that keeps a notebook, like Joan Didion. Joan Didion is extraordinary. She's sort of included in my discussion of notebook keeping, because there's a certain sense of her minimalism, her sense of understatement as being crucial. But the second thing that I think is vital in the act of practicing keeping a notebook is experimentation. That all thinking is experimental. That every time we think, we are making tangents. We're sort of making connections that are not really logical in the way that we like to think that they are. In fact, what we're often doing is repeating endlessly the relationships between things that we've been taught or that we have sort of inherited. And it's always, of course, beneficial, to have a rule of thumb, to have a general sense of patterns. But the notebook, by being not about the future in a teleological sense, but simultaneously being about itself, because I mentioned earlier that the notebook is not a product in itself. It's about other things, right? It's about your plans and the things that you're working on. But there's a paradoxical sense that the notebook itself is meaning in itself, that it actually has a value that makes it worthwhile in its own right. So that's another key element. And in that it allows a person to practice a free wandering, free floating, experimental way of thinking for its own sake, is precisely what leads to the paradoxical outcome of a new idea, of a resolution to a problem that you have. So you find that you are sort of doing two things at once, and that you're creating material like fodder for things that you're doing. Like for me, it's about videos or essays or poems, or even things that I'm just thinking about in general as questions. And I'm wanting to resolve particular intellectual questions. But at the same time, the discovery of these things doesn't, the fodder that I need isn't discovered except by allowing myself to disappear into it. And you could sort of hear that in these very recordings, the way that I work. My notebook is sort of like a reflection of how I walk. And I think that the third thing that I would add on to my attempt to break down the underlying nucleus of what a great like notebook, journal, commonplace book would be. And it has to do with sort of radical humility, a sort of humility that means that you are brought back to a sense of limitations, to a sense of actuality, that you're brought back to a sense of, in many ways, accepting the world as it is, seeing the world as it is, seeing yourself as a part of the world as it is, meaning that you're able to see your own nature and to live with your own nature and to see that self outside of yourself, so that the notebook allows you to come back home. And this is perhaps obviously the most obscure of my points, but I think that it's the most difficult to learn over time. And it has to do with a certain kind of naturalism, with a certain kind of like sensitivity to life itself and its actuality that disavows certitude. It disavows not only certitude, but absolutism and totality. It looks down upon any attempt to overly organize the material in a way that, like in these videos, I can't allow myself to overly organize. Like there's a humility in what I'm doing and just allowing myself to be what I am and record myself as I am. And so there's a certain sense in which that's what allows life itself to be exactly what it is. And that's what the notebook is wanting to discover. And I realize now that the thing that I should be making this about is the idea that the notebook is an externalization of self-education. And in many ways, that's precisely what my notebook is. And yet that has nothing to do with the initial act of keeping a notebook, which I began with some 20-something years ago. And unfortunately, I've lost most of my notebooks, or there's almost no point in which I would want to have kept them anyways. But the ones I have now for the last couple of years certainly reveal a particular kind of idiosyncratic pattern that really exudes a love for not only comprehending fundamental things, like, as I said, questions and ideas in books, but wants to organize it into an experimental way of seeing the world. In other words, what is self-education if it's not leading a person to having a voice? Like, should you always be a student in the sense in which you should always genuflect, that you should always like bow down to this sense that you are only to put your tail between your legs and sort of ask for permission, sort of apologize to use the bathroom? Or should you courageously sort of generate your own ideas and stories and notions? Because that's a major part of like what drives my own notebook. And so self-education for me is often something that's initiated by a single passage or question or a little bit of a reading, and then before I know it, I'm completely lost in developing my own twist on that thing, my own variation on that theme. And in fact, this very video itself is a reflection of that drive to make anew, to make my own, even something simple like keeping a notebook, that I want to reimagine even what that could mean. And so I spent 45 minutes discussing this thing because I'm wanting to make videos about things that are most fundamental. And I don't mean to make long videos. I promised myself my videos would be 7 minutes long, that they would be short. So that will be an aim of mine. I don't know who would be even listening by this point, but I think that in the future, I'll be very, very happy that I've recorded these videos as a sort of baseline introduction to what I'm doing by describing these fundamental elements that are at the heart of what I call Circle 8. And so this thing that I'm doing is sort of the generation of a self-perpetuating perpetual motion machine. You know, that's precisely what I think Circle 8 is about, is circulating amidst these core elements and seeing what comes as a result of giving in to one excursion or one experiment at a time. Or maybe I just like hearing the sound of my own voice. Could you blame me? I love you guys. I'm John Edward Willie, and thank you for spending this evening with me. Beautiful Kansas City evening.